So now we continue with looking at the art and culture of South and Southeast Asia, Part 2. Of course, we are looking again at the Taj Mahal. And in this image, you can see the beautiful inlaid patterns and the calligraphy. So here we have these floral and decorative inlays, and all around here are calligraphic inscriptions. So words in an Arabic or a Persian script. While we've talked a little bit about the Taj Mahal already in part one, what we'll do now is we're going to place it in its historic context. But first, let's look at a little bit of a background before we get to the Taj Mahal. And we were talking before about Indian painting. And we'll continue with this. In the last image, we were looking at Jahangir as he had gotten a painting done to send to his kind of the guy who had led the uprising and taken back the city of Kandahar. And here we see him in a different sort of a painting, but again, it's designed to send an important message. So here we have Nur Jahan, who was his favorite wife right here, and she's just basically serving tea. And down here we have one of his son-in-laws, Prince Khurram. And what happened is that as Jahangir got older, he became a little senile and probably addicted to opium, and he wasn't really operating on all cylinders, as we could say. So his wife, Nur Jahan, took over. Now this is important because it's such a rare thing to even see women depicted in the art of this time period. But she actually ended up with a lot of power. We can see her name on coins, we can see her name on royal inscriptions, and she was a very powerful leader, especially for the time. Oh, but naturally, eventually, Jahangir died, and she was sent to live she was exiled to the women's quarters, and Prince Khurram did, in fact, take over. What we can also see here is the really beautiful decorative style of painting that was developed in the Mughal courts. Once Prince Khurram came to power, he took the name Shah Jahan and set to building this tomb for his favorite wife, as we've already discussed. So we've already gone over the high points of the Taj Mahal in part one, but one thing I'd like to note is how finely this is decorated. So it could have gotten really gaudy with all that elaborate inlay, but instead it has a subtlety of form and a beauty and a harmony to it that really is why it's considered one of the great wonders of the world. And one more thing to note is that in its time there were gardens that stretched far beyond the river that people have thought flanked it created a border to the temple mosque complex, to the tomb complex. So it was surrounded by these large gardens in its day that were planted with fruit trees and cypress, which represent life and death. So ultimately, Shah Jahan ended up there with his wife, Mumtaz Mahal, and there they are to this day. All right, we're going to take another look at painting as we can compare this with the Mughal painting that we saw a few slides back. This is from the Hindu tradition. And what we had in India at the time was the Mughal strongholds that were ruled by sultans or kings, but then in the surrounding lands in both North and South India was a kind of a mishmash of different princes that were ruling primarily from the Hindu tradition. And these were called the Hindu Rajput, and they were basically people from the warrior clans of the Hindu tradition. Now they developed their own style of painting that was in some ways similar to what we saw in the Mughal style, but also quite different. This one is really fun to look at because you can see it's so much more abstracted than the more realistic Mughal style. But in some ways it's really just so lovely. They're all looking sideways, just like we would see in Egyptian art. And the colors are bright, they all kind of look alike too. The most important thing to notice here are the influences that we can see in modern art to this day. It has They have a real simplicity of form, a repetition of form, and a brightness of expression that's a little bit different than we see in the realistic Mughal style. I would say equally valid in their own right. Now let's look at one more painting, also from the Hindu tradition. And this one shows the influence of the Mughal sort of more naturalistic style. It's called The Hour of Cow Dust. And we have Krishna here. He's playing his flute and he's wearing his peacock crown. But the colors are so much more subtle. And here we also have a little bit of linear perspective in that these structures in the background are actually smaller than those in the foreground. I got to tell you, I love the cows in this image. They're so beautifully and simplistically represented, and the pastel colors throughout really give a more of a lyrical feeling to this story that is told by this painting. So now, pull up your socks and get ready because here come the British. British influence first began to be felt in India in the 17th and 18th century through the East India Trading Company. And then in the 19th century, in the year 1858, India was annexed into the British Empire and became a colony of Great Britain. It's interesting to note that the Mughals actually had controlled much of India from the year 1526 all the way to 1858, which is a fairly significant role. They had a pretty significant rule in India, and you can see their influences to this day in East Indian art and architecture. Now, what we're looking at now is something kind of interesting. I think the book uses the term strident. When the British first arrived in India, I think they had a little bit of what we could call a superiority complex. They would call the people that lived in India Orientals and really looked down upon their customs and their traditions and perhaps even their intelligence. And what we see here is a desire to really undermine everything Indian and to make it be British, and this included the arts. What we're seeing here is an example of that. It's a train station from Mumbai. The three main cities that really got the full force of the British influence is Calcutta, Madras, and Mumbai. So here at this train station, it was built, I think it opened in like 1879, and it was to honor the Queen's Golden Jubilee. But it's what we would call a Gothic revival style. But personally, I got to tell you, I think it's kind of a little overdone. It's like a cake that has too much decoration upon it. And it's made to look sort of like a cathedral, the Gothic cathedrals, except for that it's almost a little much even for that style. Now, originally, there was an image of the Queen here up on top, and that's been replaced. But they also had statues, I think these statues are still here, that represent progress, commerce, agriculture, and science. So it's meant to be a real statement of the power of the British influence upon India. Now, having said that, the British did have a lot of positive influence. For example, they built the railways, which is what this station is really there to work for. I mean, it's a train station. Eventually, though, the British caught on that perhaps some of the aesthetics that were already existing in India could be of use to their own development of the architectural style. And through the time that they ruled in India, they modified their styles quite a bit. And here we have the gateway of India. And this is at the port of Mumbai. And it was built to honor the arrival of George V in 1924. It's interesting to look at the different motivation behind these great buildings. And this was basically a gateway so the king could walk through that when he came to visit the colony of India. Well, there you go. However, let's look at it architecturally. As compared to the previous structure that we looked at, which is perhaps a little over the top, This one has achieved a little bit more grace as the British architects learned to combine the Indian style with some influences from European tradition. And in fact, it's quite beautiful. They're using the Gothic arch and the turrets, and it's actually a style that was used throughout the British Empire once they kind of figured out that they could bring in some of the existing artistic influences. And this is a hybrid style that's unique to India of this period of time. So let's look at one more painting before we move on to Southeast Asia. And this is by Abhinandranath Tagore, and it's Mother India. I find it to be a really beautiful painting as it refers back to the Hindu deities because it's a four-armed goddess, and yet it also speaks to India regaining independence, as we see happened in the early 20th century. So during this same time period that we're looking at, the art of South and Southeast Asia reflected the influences of Buddhism and Hinduism. Buddhism in particular took on a very strong role in the countries of Southeast Asia. Around the year 1200, Islam also was introduced through Chinese and Arab traders. So here's what we're looking at is Vietnamese ceramics. Now, up before about the year 1500, China really sort of had the monopoly on the ceramic trade. And you can consider that since these are island countries, and since there's so much ocean surrounding all of the countries that we're looking at, trade was big. They did a lot of ocean-going trade. Now, this particular pile of ceramics that we're looking at, this collection, came from a shipwreck that was, 20 miles or so off the coast of Vietnam. But on this sunken ship, they found over 250,000 items of ceramics. Because beginning in around the year 1500 with the Ming Dynasty, China really closed its borders and it went inward, as they say. And so people had to look elsewhere for the fine ceramics that they had been getting previously from China. And the Vietnamese made beautiful ceramics, as we see here. I just love the fact that they were able to find this beautiful collection of intact ceramics in the shipwreck and to bring it to light. As Buddhism spread into Southeast Asia, it did something that's rather predictable, in that each king and each country that adapted Buddhism sort of tweaked it to its own needs. And here we have an example of a king who aligned himself with Buddhism. This is an image that's from the reign of King Jayavarman VII, and he was a Cambodian king. And he took power in 1181, and it ended a time of a lot of conflict, inner and outer. And once this guy took the throne, he adopted Buddhist principles, whereas all of his ancestors had followed the Hindu tradition. But he took it one step further, and he called himself a sort of a Buddha king. So he undertook to do this massive building program, and he built all sorts of temples. But this particular Buddha is an example of the real sublime and simplicity of some of the sculptures of the time. And we can compare it to what we've seen in the Indian tradition and the Afghani tradition and notice the difference. One other kind of fun thing is that the features, the face of this particular Buddha probably look like the king himself, because all of the Buddhas that he made had the same portrait, so to speak. So what Jayavarman did is he not only declared Buddhism to be the sort of state religion, he kind of said, well, and I'm the King Buddha. You gotta love that. All right, let's move on. When Buddhism spread to Myanmar or Burma, the rulers there took on the task of building innumerable temples. We've already looked at the Bagan Plain that has over 2,300 temples on this one plain. So here we have a stupa, or a Buddhist temple, from South Burma. It's in Yangon, or which is more popularly known as Rangoon, which is a port city in southern Burma. So this was originally built around a core temple that supposedly had relics from the original Buddha, including a lock of the Buddha's hair. That's pretty similar to what we see in Catholic temples in the European tradition. So over the years, they've built again and again resurfaced this temple, added more gold, and continue to renovate to this day, which is something that we see in the temples in Burma. So here we're going to look at yet another Buddha. But there's some important things to note about this one. What I'd like you to consider is the differences between different cultures and how they depict this important religious or philosophical figure. This particular image is from what we call the Sukhothai period, and it was a relatively short-lived dynasty around the year 1200, but it gave rise to great innovations in Thai art. After the fall of the Sukhothai culture, then the capital moved to Bangkok, Thailand. And it was here that the great temple complex was created to house the Emerald Buddha, which you're looking at here. Now there's great legends around this particular Buddha. Supposedly it went back to the original Buddhist kings in India, and the green color has great significance with those stories. It's actually not made of emerald, it's just green. It's made of jadeite. But one of the interesting things about it is that it is reclothed about 4 times a year. So they change the robes on this Buddha. And the original king, back in late 1700s, built a temple complex to house this Buddha. It's very important in the Thai Buddhist tradition. And here it is. Wow. Okay, so this is not the original complex. It was greatly expanded upon after it was originally built, but it is 200 acres with literally hundreds of buildings, and it's still used to this day as an important center for Thai Buddhist practice, and it has great political importance also. So here we have our final slide, the Petronas Towers, which are from Malaysia. Now these structures are, if you can imagine, they're over 1,200 feet tall, and they were built in 1998. For about 6 years after that, they were the tallest buildings in the world. They have a little sky bridge there at the 41st and 42nd floor, which you can see. But what's interesting to note about this is that the architects really gave a nod to the traditional Islamic and Buddhist architecture with the building of these temples. And here we have the most modern era as reflecting all of the history that we've studied in the past. And this concludes the audio lecture on the art of South and Southeast Asia. Thanks for listening.